Intelligence agencies are on high alert, and for good reason. Ukraine launched a precision strike that instantly changed the tone of the war. What began as a targeted operation quickly escalated into a geopolitical flashpoint. The moment the first explosions landed on their intended targets, Russian air defense systems snapped into action. Sirens wailed across multiple border regions, radar screens lit up with signatures of incoming drones and missiles, and videos flooded social media showing fiery impacts across Russian military infrastructure. Within minutes, Moscow accused the United States of orchestrating the entire operation. Russian officials moved swiftly to frame the event not as a Ukrainian battlefield success, but as a direct provocation engineered in Washington. State media hosts repeated the same message with almost rehearsed precision. Ukraine alone could not execute an operation of this scale. Therefore, the U.S. must be behind it. This narrative spread rapidly, becoming the dominant theme on Russian television throughout the evening. Analysts on those programs spoke with dramatic certainty, describing the strike as a calculated Western escalation, while ignoring the growing evidence that Ukraine had been intensifying its domestic drone production and conducting deeper, more coordinated operations on its own for months. Still, the Kremlin needed a story that redirected blame outward, and state TV was more than ready to deliver. But what startled many observers wasn't the propaganda machine that was expected. It was the speed and intensity of the Kremlin's military and political reaction. For the first time in weeks, senior Russian commanders stepped forward with unusually blunt language, warning of consequences aimed directly at the United States. These were not vague threats about NATO or Western involvement. These were pointed statements hinting at retaliation against U.S. assets, interests, or partners. Intelligence sources later reported that Russian strategic forces were placed on a higher state of readiness, and military aircraft at several bases began repositioning movements that analysts interpreted as signals rather than preparations for immediate action. Behind closed doors, Western officials noted a shift in tone. The Kremlin wasn't simply expressing anger, it was attempting to reassert control. The strike had exposed vulnerabilities inside Russia, vulnerabilities that could undermine public confidence in the government's ability to protect its own territory. By accusing Washington, the Kremlin not only redirected domestic blame, but also created a justification for harsher rhetoric and potential escalation. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government remained deliberately vague. Officials neither confirmed nor denied responsibility, leaving the strike to speak for itself. Ukrainian military analysts subtly hinted that the operation demonstrated Kyiv's rapidly evolving capabilities. The message was understated but clear. Ukraine could now reach deeper and more strategically than before. In the hours following the incident, global reaction was immediate. NATO allies warned Russia against using the strike as a pretext for escalation. The White House issued a sharp response, rejecting Moscow's accusations and reaffirming that Ukraine had the right to defend itself. The tension that followed was thick, the kind of atmosphere where one miscalculation could trigger a far larger crisis. The precision strike had landed not just on Russian soil, but at the very center of U.S.-Russia tensions. The war's tone had changed, and the world felt it instantly. Hours after the strike, Russia's Ministry of Defense issued a late-night announcement that immediately shifted the global mood. The statement was unusually sharp, even by Kremlin standards. It warned that any U.S. involvement in Ukraine's operation, real or perceived, could trigger retaliatory action. The wording was deliberate, vague enough to keep analysts guessing, yet threatening enough to send a chill through Western capitals. Within minutes, Russian state propaganda channels went into overdrive. Talk show hosts, former generals, and political loyalists began repeating the same talking point. If the U.S. helped Ukraine strike targets inside Russia, then Russia has the right to respond against American assets anywhere in the world. This wasn't mere commentary. It was a coordinated escalation of narrative warfare. Some channels floated the possibility of Russia targeting U.S. military bases in Europe or intercepting American reconnaissance drones flying over international waters. Others pushed more extreme scenarios, cyber attacks on American infrastructure, naval provocations in the Arctic, or even retaliatory strikes on U.S. supplied assets in the Middle East. The aim was clear: create uncertainty, raise fear, and force Washington to rethink its level of support for Kyiv. But behind the scenes, the situation was even more concerning. Intelligence sources across Europe and the U.S. reported unusual and unexplained movement among Russia's strategic aircraft fleets. Several long-range bombers normally kept at secure, predictable bases were repositioned. Satellite imagery showed increased activity at airfields housing nuclear-capable aircraft, along with a noticeable uptick in ground crews working late into the night under floodlights. Meanwhile, communication intercepts indicated heightened alert levels at certain Russian bases near Ukraine and inside the country's western regions. Air defense systems were switched to combat readiness, radar coverage expanded, and patrol routes were intensified. None of these signs indicated an imminent attack, but they suggested that Russia wanted the world to notice the activity. This was a message operation as much as a military one. Inside Washington, analysts interpreted the moves as strategic signaling, the Kremlin's way of reminding the U.S. that Russia still sees itself as a nuclear superpower capable of global reach. It was escalation through posture, not action. But even posture, when misread or mishandled, can spiral quickly. Diplomats described the Kremlin's behavior as the most confrontational messaging in months. Some warned that Russia's internal political pressures, battlefield setbacks, economic strain, and domestic discontent could be driving Moscow toward more aggressive rhetoric. When a government feels cornered, its leaders sometimes lash out to regain control of the narrative. Meanwhile, inside Russia, state media framed the late-night announcement as a patriotic rallying cry. Commentators told viewers that Russia was being pushed into a historic confrontation with the United States, one that demanded unity and resolve. Footage of military drills, missile launches, and warships at sea filled television screens. It was designed to project strength, even if the reality on the ground was far more complicated. For the outside world, though, the message from the Kremlin was unmistakable. Cross the line, whatever Moscow decides that line is, and the U.S. will feel it. It was a threat wrapped in ambiguity, and ambiguity is what makes it dangerous. The next move now belonged to Washington, and the entire world was watching. The response from Washington was immediate and unmistakably sharp. Within hours of Russia's late-night threat, the White House convened an unscheduled press briefing, a clear sign that the administration wanted to seize control of the narrative before Moscow's message could spread unchecked. Reporters packed into the briefing room, cameras clicking as officials stepped to the podium with a posture that suggested urgency, not routine diplomacy. The spokesperson wasted no time. Before taking questions, they delivered a direct, uncompromising statement rejecting Russia's accusations outright. The Kremlin's claims, they said, were nothing more than desperate attempts to shift blame for its own failures. The phrasing was deliberate. It didn't just deny U.S. involvement, it attacked the very premise of Russia's narrative. Washington wanted the world to understand that Moscow's rhetoric was not evidence but deflection. Officials emphasized repeatedly that Ukraine acted independently, relying on its own expanding intelligence network, domestic drone production, and battlefield awareness. The U.S., they said, supports Ukraine's defense, but the decisions about where and how to strike are made by Kyiv alone. This wasn't merely a clarification. It was a strategic message to the Kremlin. Don't drag us into your excuses. But the most important moment came when a senior official delivered a line that instantly made global headlines. Any attack on American personnel or facilities will be met with consequences that Russia does not want. The room fell silent for a moment after the statement, not because it was unexpected, but because it was unusually blunt. Washington had just issued one of its clearest red lines since the war began. Analysts later noted that the wording mirrored the kind of language typically reserved for deterring direct threats from nuclear-capable adversaries. It wasn't a vague warning. It wasn't cautious language crafted to leave room for diplomatic ambiguity. It was a firm declaration of how far the U.S. was prepared to go and how little tolerance it had for Moscow's escalation through intimidation. In follow-up questions, officials doubled down. They explained that Russia's threats were irresponsible, destabilizing, and disconnected from battlefield reality. Several pointed out that Russia had a long history of accusing other nations of actions that embarrassed Moscow or exposed vulnerabilities in its defenses. This, they implied, was simply the latest chapter in that pattern. Behind the scenes, U.S. intelligence agencies raised their alert levels, not because an attack seemed likely, but because deterrence only works when backed by readiness. Surveillance assets increased monitoring of Russian military movements. Diplomats briefed allies across Europe and Asia. NATO officials were looped into a coordinated response plan, ensuring that any Russian miscalculation would be met with a unified front. The shift was fast, almost jarringly so. In less than a day, Washington went from standard diplomatic reactions to full-fledged deterrence posture, and that sudden shift sent its own message to Moscow. If Russia thought the U.S. would hesitate, soften its tone, or reduce its support for Ukraine under pressure, it had badly misjudged the moment. The Kremlin had escalated with threats. Washington had replied with consequences. NATO allies quickly rallied behind the White House, issuing coordinated statements that left no room for interpretation. Within hours, foreign ministers from the UK, Germany, France, Poland, and several Baltic states condemned Russia's threat as dangerous and irresponsible, echoing Washington's assessment almost word for word. The unity was striking and intentional. NATO wanted Moscow to understand that this was not merely a dispute between Russia and the United States, but a challenge to the entire Western security architecture. In Brussels, NATO's Secretary General called an emergency consultation to assess Russia's rhetoric and evaluate whether Moscow's military posture had changed in any meaningful way. Standing at the podium afterward, he spoke carefully but firmly. Russia must refrain from further escalation. Any threat against one of us affects all of us. It was a familiar line, but the gravity behind it felt sharper this time. Across Europe, political leaders urged calm, not out of weakness, but out of awareness that miscalculations in such a volatile moment could be catastrophic. Yet privately, many acknowledged that tensions had not been this high since the opening months of Russia's full-scale invasion in early 2022. European intelligence agencies circulated internal reports warning that Russia's sudden spike in nuclear-related rhetoric was abnormal, even by Kremlin standards. The reaction in global markets was immediate. Oil prices spiked within minutes of Russia's announcement, reflecting fears that heightened tensions could disrupt energy flows or trigger new sanctions. European gas futures surged as traders braced for the possibility of retaliatory cuts or infrastructure sabotage. Meanwhile, defense stocks soared across the U.S. and Europe, a predictable but telling sign of market anxiety. Investors were not waiting to see how the situation unfolded. They were already pricing in risk. Economists described the reaction as a flash shock, the kind of sudden market movement seen only when geopolitical events appear capable of spiraling quickly. For many analysts, that was the concern. Not that Russia was preparing an imminent attack on the U.S., but that its rhetoric hinted at desperation, and desperate governments sometimes make unpredictable decisions. Meanwhile, security experts on both sides of the Atlantic issued warnings of their own. Some argued that Russia's aggressive posture was an attempt to mask escalating battlefield failures, especially after Ukraine successfully struck high-value targets inside Russian territory. Others believed the Kremlin was laying the groundwork for a new phase of its war strategy, perhaps preparing its population for harsher mobilization measures or justifying a wider military response. The uncertainty was what troubled diplomats most. Russia's behavior didn't follow the usual pattern of symbolic saber-rattling. The speed, the tone, the emphasis on U.S. involvement, it all suggested that Moscow was trying to create an atmosphere of crisis. Whether that was merely political theater or a precursor to something more dangerous was impossible to know. And so the world watched closely, anxiously, trying to read between the lines of every Russian statement, every NATO response, every piece of intelligence emerging behind closed doors. No one could say with confidence whether this moment was just posturing or preparation for something far more serious. As night fell, intelligence agencies in Washington and across Europe shifted into a posture of heightened vigilance. War rooms buzzed with activity as analysts reviewed satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and troop movement reports for any sign that Russia might escalate beyond rhetoric. Large screens displayed live updates from multiple regions, from Kaliningrad to the Black Sea, while teams worked in rotating shifts to ensure no warning went unnoticed. Nobody wanted to misinterpret Moscow's threat. Nobody wanted to underestimate it either. Ukraine, meanwhile, pressed forward with its operations. Officials in Kyiv made it clear through their actions that they would not be intimidated, even as Russia ramped up its nuclear-tinged language. Drones continued targeting military infrastructure, supply hubs, and radar systems deep inside Russian territory. Ukrainian commanders understood that hesitation now would only embolden the Kremlin. Their message to Moscow and to the world was unmistakable. Ukraine will not back down. Inside Russia, the Kremlin intensified its warnings toward the United States. State news agencies released a series of carefully crafted statements accusing Washington of direct involvement and aggression. Late-night talk shows, which often serve as unofficial messaging channels for the government, featured retired generals and pro-Kremlin commentators who spoke in apocalyptic undertones. They talked about red lines, retaliation, and the inevitable consequences of American interference. This wasn't casual propaganda. It was deliberate psychological pressure aimed at both domestic and international audiences. Yet the White House remained steady, almost calculatedly calm. U.S. officials repeated their message with unwavering clarity. America will defend its personnel, its facilities, and its allies. Full stop. There was no hesitation, no softening of language, no sign of backing away. Washington wanted Moscow to understand that threats would not alter U.S. support for Ukraine or intimidate the West into silence. The administration's tone had shifted from diplomatic restraint to firm deterrence. By midnight, the standoff had become unmistakable. Two nuclear powers were staring each other down, not through missiles or troop formations, but through words, warnings, and military postures. Each side understood the consequences of miscalculation. Each side was determined not to appear weak. Russia was escalating through increasingly aggressive threats. The U.S. was answering with unwavering resolve. And caught between them was a conflict already reshaping Europe's security landscape, a conflict that now seemed on the verge of entering a new and unpredictable phase. Diplomats quietly warned that this could be a pivotal turning point. Intelligence officials whispered that the next 48 hours might reveal whether Russia was merely posturing to hide its battlefield losses or preparing for something more serious. Markets, governments, and military alliances braced themselves for the unknown. What happens next will not simply determine the trajectory of the war in Ukraine. It could redefine the relationship between Russia and the West for years, even decades to come. The world now watches, holding its breath, as the next chapter begins to unfold. If you want, I can now combine all expanded parts into a full YouTube script, create thumbnail prompts, tags, hooks, or an intro-outro. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep dive reporting, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel.